Welcome to Pathway. We're so glad you're with us today. If you're new here, we'd love to get to know you. We invite you to fill out a digital Connect card on the PCC at Home app or pccfw.tv, or text the word Connect to Pathway text number. To all of you who have continued to give support financially during this time, we want to say thank you. We're so grateful, and we want you to know that from online worship to Pathway groups to community outreach, your generosity has made ministry possible. If you'd like to give, there are several ways you can do that. There are give buttons on our website at pccfw.tv and on the PCC at Home mobile app. You can also text the word give to our text number, or you can mail a check to the PCC office. For all the latest COVID-related updates, be sure to visit our website. Just click the red banner at the top of the page to view new announcements and find quick links for Kid City Online, content for students, adults, and more. You can also access all of this through the COVID link on the PCC at Home app. As always, our services will continue to air at pccfw.tv, so if your health is vulnerable, we hope you'll continue to be part of our online community. Thanks again for choosing to show up here.
Well, hi, everybody. It's good to be with all of you. I'm so excited to be able to share with you this weekend. If you were with us last week, you know that we began our Christmas series together called Anthems Suite. And over these few weeks, we're going to be looking at and leaning into and learning from some of our favorite Christmas hymns. And again, Brad did a great job getting us started last week talking about one of my personal favorites, the song, O Come, Emmanuel. And he reminded us that even in moments of waiting, that God is still working because God is faithful. And having talked about that together last week, what I want to do is continue the conversation today by talking about another one of my personal favorites, the song, O Come All Ye Faithful. And specifically some of the words that we sing in the chorus of that song that we want to reflect on today, the words, O come, let us adore him. These are some of my favorite words to reflect on and sing about at Christmas time for really a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons that I love them is that they're just such simple words. They're so easy to understand. It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone can sing these words and know exactly what we're singing about. And in addition to that, though, one of the other reasons I love this song so much is because of a personal memory, a personal experience that I have with these particular words that happened about 15 years ago. Natalie and I, we were in Israel at the time. We were traveling on our second trip to Israel with a tour that we were leading with a group of people from our church. And on that particular trip in that year, we decided to go over Christmas break. And so there we were in Israel just a few days actually after celebrating Christmas back here at home. And so we were over there in Israel, and one of the places that we went to was the town of Bethlehem. And we visited a church there called the Church of the Nativity, and it was built hundreds of years ago, actually at the traditional site where many scholars believe that Jesus was born. And as you can imagine, just on the heels of Christmas Day, we were there, and because of the time of year that we were there, it was actually quite busy. A lot of people were wanting to visit and just reflect on the Christmas story there. And so there were all sorts of us that kind of made our way into the church, and then there were dozens of us that actually crammed our way down into the basement of that church in the remnants of a cave that many people believe to be the actual place where Jesus was born. And so we all crammed in there together. It was obviously very pre-COVID at that point. And as we gathered in that space, there were people from all over the world. We were all kind of just reflecting and hanging out and spending some time there. And all of a sudden, in the midst of all of us kind of crammed in there together, there was someone in the crowd that started to sing these words, the words, "O come, let us adore him." And I'll never forget when I looked across the room and I saw who it was that was singing. You'll never believe it. It was Michael Bublé. And not really, actually, he wasn't there singing that, but it would have been cool for those of you that like his Christmas music. But just some random guy in the crowd started singing the words, "Oh, come let us adore him." And it didn't take long as people started to hear him sing and they recognized the tune and they recognized the words. The whole room of us, several dozen of us, again, people from all over the world representing several different languages, all started to sing this song together, "Oh, come let us adore him." And it was so powerful. It was so beautiful. It was so profound. I'll never forget it. It has always stuck with me. I think about it every time we think about these words, every time we sing these words at Christmas. And they're such great words for us as a church in our day today to think about as well. I think in these words, "Oh, come let us adore him," it's such an invitation for us to come and to do just that. It's such a reminder for us that not only is Christ faithful, as Brad talked about last week, but also Christ is worthy of our worship and our praise. And in light of that, and because of that, these words are actually a great reminder for us as well of the big idea that I want to talk about with you today. If you're following along, you can fill along in your notes as we make our way through this. But the big idea that I want to talk about with you today that I think these words remind us of is this, that when it comes to Christmas, the Christmas story and the Christmas season, Christmas always comes with a choice. Either to ignore Jesus or adore Jesus. And this is what I want to talk about with you. Spend a few minutes just kind of reflecting on together today. And to help us with that, what I want to do is I actually want to look at the lives and stories of some of the characters from the original Christmas story from 2,000 years ago. You see, I think when we look at their example, when we look at their story, what we find is that with them, we actually see bits of all of us in all of them and in their stories. In fact, I think that's part of God's desire for the scriptures. I think that's part of his heart and his dream for why he's given us the stories that we find in the Bible, that they wouldn't just be stories that we read and learn about, but rather they'd be stories that somehow we kind of find ourselves in. And in some ways, I think like that, the scriptures kind of function like a mirror for us. They reflect back to us examples of ourselves, both the good and the bad, and give us opportunity to be challenged and confronted and convicted and encouraged and to hopefully grow from that. And so that's my hope for us today. I want to spend a few minutes looking at some of these characters. I want to talk with you about 3 different characters or groups of characters that reflect this whole choice between ignoring and adoring Jesus today. And so again, those 3 characters, those 3 groups of characters I want to talk about are these. I want to talk with you about the king, the crowd, and the shepherds. So let's start first with the king. And what are we talking about with that? Well, if you're familiar with the Christmas story, the king that we're talking about is a guy by the name of King Herod. And as we consider that choice that we have between ignoring or adoring Jesus, King Herod was certainly one that chose to ignore him. And he did it out of his pride and his self-centeredness. Let me explain for you how we see that in his story. King Herod, again, 2,000 years ago, was a bit of maybe what we might call a puppet king of sorts. He was in many ways self-appointed. He hadn't earned that through some kind of lineage or bloodline or some authority that he inherited in some way. But instead, he kind of wiggled his way into becoming the king of Judea, the king of the Jews, through some crafty manipulation and arrangements that he made with the Roman Empire. And so most of the Jewish people of his day actually resented him and resisted him as king. And most scholars will tell us that when it comes to King Herod, he was an absolutely brilliant architect and builder and did some just incredible things with all of that back in his day. But what he had in all of that, he lacked when it came to being a good leader. He was a terrible leader, emotionally and mentally unstable and unhealthy and dysfunctional in so many ways. In fact, one of his greatest fears that showed up over and over again is he was constantly paranoid and worried about someone stealing away his authority, his rule, and reign from him, which I think explains some of his response then to Jesus when Jesus was born. And we read about that in the book of Matthew, chapter 2. Matthew was one of Jesus' first disciples, one of his first followers, and he did us a great service by recording for us so many of the stories that he experienced and learned of with Jesus' life and ministry. And so he describes Jesus' birth in Matthew chapter 2, and here's what he says, starting in verse 1. It says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, there were magi, or what we often refer to as wise men, who came from the east to Jerusalem, and they asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews?" And as soon as those words came out of their mouths, so it began for Herod, his paranoia. As soon as he heard this question about the one born King of the Jews, Herod thought to himself, wait a minute, that's me. What do you mean King of the Jews? I'm the King of the Jews. What's going on here? And so they went on to explain. They said, well, we saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him. And when Herod heard this, it says that he was disturbed, which I think is such a great word there. When we think about that word, I think it literally means something like this that we see up here on the screen, right? Like, wait a minute. Oh, no, he didn't. He's not the King of the Jews. I'm the King of the Jews. And so Herod asked his religious leaders, where was the Messiah going to be born? And they told him, in Bethlehem. And so it goes on in Matthew 2, it says, Herod called the Magi secretly. He found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem, and he said, go and search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, come and report to me so that I too can go and worship him, which of course wasn't at all what Herod had in mind. And thankfully, we read later in that chapter that God warned the Magi in a dream not to tell Herod where the baby Jesus could be found. And so eventually we read on when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time that he had learned from the Magi. So again, we have King Herod, who actually in many ways was threatened by Jesus. When he heard about this idea of a king, the King of the Jews that had been born, he didn't receive him, he didn't celebrate him, he resented him. He was threatened by him, and he chose to resist him. He ignored who Jesus was. He ignored what Jesus had come to do, and he actually ignored his own personal desperate need for Jesus. And so rather than responding with hope and joy and peace and celebration because his king, his one true king, his Messiah and rescuer had come, he wallowed in his kind of self-pity and frustration and discouragement and tried to destroy and get rid of Jesus. And in this way, again, he ignored him out of his pride and out of his self-centeredness. And the reason I share that with all of us this weekend as we think about this together is that when it comes to how we respond to Jesus, I think for some of us, this is the same reason that for many of us, maybe we respond in the exact same way to Jesus as well. I think for some of us, we respond by trying to ignore Jesus out of our own pride and self-centeredness. We, like King Herod, we want to be king of our own lives. We don't want someone else to tell us what to do or call the shots for us. When I think about this in my own life and the lives of other people, I think many times we can resist like King Herod did because, first of all, we don't like the idea of King Jesus. We don't like the idea of having a king that is going to call the shots and tell us what to do and have the throne in our lives that we think we're the only ones that should have it. And for some of us, again, it's the idea of King Jesus. For others of us, so I think we wrestle with this, we ignore him, we resist him, we resent him, not just because we don't like the idea of King Jesus. Some of us, we don't like the ideals of King Jesus. And when you think about the idea of Jesus being king and ruling and reigning so that his way is the way of things, there are certain things about the way of Jesus that if we're honest, some of us, when the rubber meets the road with some of those, they kind of push us the wrong way. We're not comfortable with them. They're not easy. We don't like the kinds of things that Jesus modeled and invites us into as followers of him. Things like we have up here on the screen, his sacrificial way and giving of ourselves the way that Jesus did for us and modeled for us, caring for the poor, pouring ourselves out, giving ourselves away, using what we have, not just for ourselves, but to bless and to serve others, saying no to our appetites and temptations, our longings, the things that we want to do that we probably know we shouldn't do and that we know are destructive to us or others, but to follow Jesus and let him be king. We don't always like giving up on those things, our appetites and our temptations, forfeiting our comforts and our conveniences to be on mission with Jesus, to be a part of what he's doing in the world, loving our enemies, forgiving others, and so many other things that characterized what it looks like when Jesus is king. Some of us, we respond the exact same way as King Herod, not only because we don't like the idea of King Jesus, but sometimes we don't like his ideals, the ideals of King Jesus either. And so maybe some of you find yourself there, you've been there at different times in your life. This is what I think is so compelling about Christmas, both the Christmas story and also the Christmas season as we said at the beginning of our time together today, it's another opportunity, it's another invitation for us to choose again. How will we respond to him? To ignore him out of pride and self-centeredness, or adore him? So that's one of the examples I wanted us to wrestle with for a few minutes, the example of the king who ignored him out of pride and self-centeredness. The second example I want to share with you about then is the example of the crowd. And what we find in their story is that they too ignored Jesus, but not out of pride and self-centeredness, but this time for them, they ignored out of distractions because of their busyness, because they were overlooking Jesus. The crowd that we're talking about, of course, is the people that we read about in the city of Bethlehem in the time of Jesus' birth. And we don't know a lot about them. We only get little snippets and kind of like some very kind of veiled descriptions of the people that would have been in Bethlehem and why they were in Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth. But I want to read about this and then just make a couple comments on this for you. In another book of the Bible, the book of Luke, in his account of Jesus' birth, he writes this, starting in verse 1. He says, "In those days, Caesar Augustus, who was the ruler of the Roman Empire at the time, he was the guy in charge of the empire that was in charge of the world. And he wanted to know how big his empire was. And so he issued a decree that a census, a counting should be taken of the entire Roman world. And so to do that, they had everyone go to their kind of ancestors' hometown, to go back to their roots, to sign in and to register there so they could count and know how many people were in the Roman Empire. And so everyone went to their own town to register. And we read that Joseph, who was Jesus' dad, also went up from the town of Nazareth in northern Israel, where he lived, to Judea, to Bethlehem, to the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who is Jesus' mother, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child, the baby Jesus, of course. And while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And it says she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger, a feeding trough in the animal stable, because there was no guest room available for them. Again, we don't get a lot of details here about the people in Bethlehem at that time, but as we read through this, we are able to kind of observe a couple of things with this. First of all, we realize that Bethlehem was unusually crowded at this moment when Jesus was born. I mean, this small, little, insignificant town was now kind of busting at the seams as people from all over the world had come back here to register as part of this census. There were all kinds of strangers and visitors that had come to town, and as you kind of imagine that for a moment, you can almost imagine the wheels of the entrepreneurs and the business-savvy people beginning to spin their minds as they think about what a great opportunity this presented for them to sell all of their trinkets or set up a yard sale or list their home on Airbnb or whatever it might be. They were going to take advantage of the surge of people that had come to Bethlehem. And it was a big opportunity. It was a great opportunity, almost so big and so great that seemingly all of them missed the fact that something even so much bigger and so much greater was happening right in their midst. The Messiah, the true King of Kings, Lord of Lords, our rescuer, our only hope, the one that they had been waiting for hundreds to thousands of years, the one that God had promised to send into the world that they had been waiting for, had come. And these were his people, not only the Jewish people, but this was their family tree. This was his family line. These were his ancestors, the people. I mean, if anybody should have recognized him and acknowledged him and received him and embraced him and celebrated Jesus, it was them. And yet what we find in the story is that rather than all of that, they didn't even notice him. He had to be born in an animal stable and laid in a manger. Because rather than celebrating and receiving and adoring, they ignored him because of all of their distractions and all of their busyness. Which sounds sadly so familiar, right? For many of us, I mean, even in our day, thousands of years later, I think it's so easy for us to fall into the same trap and respond in the same way. I mean, every Christmas season certainly comes with all of this, all kinds of distractions and busyness. You have all the get-togethers and the shopping and the Black Friday deals and Cyber Monday deals and all the things that we try to do, all the normal hustle and bustle. And then you have a unique year like this year with all these other things that are happening, the pandemic and politics that serve as just relentless distractions and busyness for us all. And if we're not careful, we can respond in the same way they did by inadvertently ignoring Jesus because of our distractions and our busyness. And yet, just like I reminded you when it comes to the king and how we have a tendency to respond the way he did, I want to remind you again with regard to the crowd and how we can fall into that trap as well, that Christmas, no matter how we've responded in the past or even responding up to this very moment, this Christmas season, and whenever we reflect on the Christmas story, it's an opportunity, an invitation again to choose how we will respond to Jesus. Not by ignoring, hopefully, like the king because of pride and self-centeredness, or not by ignoring like the crowd because of distractions and busyness, but hopefully as we have an opportunity to choose again in this season, I hope that we'll respond in the way of this last group of characters I want to talk about with you. Again, not the king or the crowd, but this group of characters, the group of shepherds. And again, we read about them in Luke's account of Jesus' birth. In Luke chapter 2, we see that rather than ignoring Jesus because of pride or self-centeredness, or ignoring him because of distractions and busyness, the shepherds instead chose to adore Jesus because of their awe and because of their gratefulness. And I want to read about this for you in Luke chapter 2, again, continuing what we started earlier there. Starting in verse 8, Luke writes this: "There were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. It says, an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified." Like you are when an angel shows up out of nowhere. And the angel said to them, though, "Don't be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for the whole world, for all the people." And they went on to explain that Christ, the Lord, had come into the world, that he had arrived. A whole host of angels showed up and praised God and declared how they would find him and where they would find him. And it goes on later in Luke chapter 2, it says, when the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. And so it says they hurried off. I love those two words. If you underline in your Bible, I encourage you just to underline those words. They heard and then they hurried. They hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger. And when they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child, and all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. The shepherds refused to ignore and instead chose to adore. That's such a great example for us. I mean, here the angels come and announce Christ's birth to this unlikely group of shepherds. I mean, they weren't highly esteemed. They weren't highly regarded. Nobody was really paying attention to them, and yet they were the ones the angels came to and announced Christ's birth. And I think in many ways it's because they were humble enough to receive it, and they were available enough to receive it as well. And I love their response when they heard. They weren't concerned about their own kingdoms or fame or their own prosperity or entrepreneurship. All they were concerned about was that the king they had been waiting for had come. And they were willing to drop whatever it is they were doing in that moment, to run to him, to be with him, to see him with their own eyes, to experience his presence in their own hearts, and to worship him as the only one who was worthy, as the king who deserved our worship and our praise. And I don't know about you, but whenever I read that part of the story and I read their example, it's so compelling and so convicting for me. And I think it's in their example that all of us are invited to respond in the same way. To refuse to ignore Jesus and instead choose to adore him. So how do we do that? What are some things that we can do to help us with this as we walk through this Christmas season, as we reflect again on the Christmas story? And I want to give you just a few quick thoughts, a few challenges with this. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, and yet these are some of the things that I've grappled with that I'm going to try to do something about in my own life in this season. I want to challenge all of you to do the same as well. And the first thing I think is going to be important for us, if we want to adore Jesus more in this Christmas season, the first thing I think we need to do, the place we need to start, is that we need to make a commitment to reject our pride. Again, just like King Herod and the example that we talked about with him, I think all of us can fall into that trap because of our pride, our selfishness, our self-centeredness. We can easily respond to Jesus by trying to ignore him, who he is, what he came to do, our desperate need for him, because, again, both because of the idea of King Jesus that we don't like or the ideals of King Jesus that we don't like. And yet I hope in this season that we'll choose a better way than that we'll reject that, and instead that we'll humble ourselves before him, that we'll bend our knee before King Jesus and believe that everything is better and that we're at our best when Jesus is king. It doesn't mean everything will be easy, but things will be good with him. And so my prayer, one of the things I hope we'll pray for as individuals, as a church, one of the things I hope we'll pursue in this Christmas season is, first of all, to just reject the pride and self-centeredness that will keep us from adoring our King. A second thing I want to challenge us with then is this, not only to reject pride, but also then to remove distractions. And again, just like we read about with the crowd in Jesus' day, the people in Bethlehem at his birth that were so easily distracted by all the busyness and things that were happening, we can do that too. And so I think if we're going to adore him more in this season, we've got to make a decision to recognize so many of the distractions that keep us from him and to do something about removing those and getting them out of the way. And so whatever that is for us, maybe it's just one thing, maybe it's a few things, maybe it's cutting back on our technology, putting our phones away, jumping off social media, or the news, or all the different things that can distract us that way, or other things that we give our best energy and effort to that are keeping us from worshiping him. Whatever that is, we need to remove some of those distractions so we can adore him more this Christmas. A third thing I want to challenge us with then is this, not only reject pride and remove distractions, but then thirdly, just like we see with the shepherds, I want to challenge us to run to Jesus. And of course, that's kind of a picture, a metaphor. We may not literally run to him, but I think that image of just doing whatever we can to drop what we're doing, to go be with him, to see him with our own eyes, to experience his presence in our own hearts so that we can worship him and adore him. We just got to make a decision to do whatever we can to do that well in this season. To not only lead ourselves into that, but our families and as a church family, that we would commit to spending time with Jesus, to worship him as our King, as the one who's worthy of our praise, and to spend time in worship and prayer with him each day, to spend time reading about him and encountering him in the words and the stories of the scriptures each day. And you heard earlier about the worship album or the Christmas album that our worship team put out. We hope you'll take advantage of that and use that as a tool to adore him more in this season, to run to Jesus. Maybe you want to follow along with our God Time guides that give Bible reading for each day, or find an Advent or Christmas reading plan you can use, or maybe even just reading through the book of John, John's account of Jesus' life and ministry that we find in the New Testament. There are about 21 chapters in that book, the book of John, and we don't quite have 21 days between now and Christmas, but you could read about a chapter a day and read the whole book before we get to Christmas as a way of running to be with Jesus, to worship and adore him. And so we need to do that. We need to reject pride, and we need to remove distractions, run to Jesus. And then lastly, I want to challenge us to relay the message. Again, this is one of the other things that I think is so compelling about the example of the shepherds. Not only did they receive and respond to the message of Jesus themselves that the angels gave to them, but as part of adoring him, they also relayed the message to others around them. This is what it means to relay the message, right? You receive it from someone, but you also pass it along to someone. This is what you do when you're in awe and when you're grateful. This is what you would do when you adore something. And we see this in so many ways in our culture, right? I mean, every time we have a beautiful sunrise or sunset over Fort Wayne, what happens? You'll see pictures of it plastered all over social media because people are so in awe of what they've seen, they can't keep it to themselves. They have to pass it along to somebody. We do this with sports. You see a great play in a sporting event, and it's all the buzz. People are talking about, did you see this? Can you believe that happened? And my kids even do this with video games. So we'll hear them come running up the stairs in our house or playing some video game, and they just want to tell us about something that happened or have us come down and watch some replay. And whenever I think about that, I think, man, if my kids can do that with a video game, then certainly we as the people of King Jesus can do that with the good news of his arrival and his work and his kingdom as well. It's one of the ways that we can adore him more, not only rejecting pride and removing distractions and running to Jesus ourselves, but also relaying the message of the good news of who he is and what he's done and what he's accomplished and what he invites us into with him. I mentioned at the very beginning today that Christmas is such a great opportunity for us because with every Christmas season and every time we reflect on the Christmas story, it always comes with a choice to either ignore Jesus or adore Jesus. And my hope and prayer for all of us, individually, as families, as a church family, as we walk through these next several weeks together, that we would be people that stop long enough to reflect on our own response to him and that we would choose to follow the example of the shepherds, who again weren't concerned about themselves. They weren't concerned about their own kingdoms or notoriety or the opportunities that being in Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth would give, but instead they were only concerned about being faithful and going to worship and adore the one who is worthy of our praise. I pray that we'll be people that follow their lead with that, and given the choice this Christmas to ignore or adore, that in awe and gratefulness to him, we would run to be with him, to worship and praise him for his glory, just as this song invites us to do. Before we wrap up today, our team's going to lead us actually in the singing of a few variations of this, the chorus of O Come All Ye Faithful, the words, O come, let us adore him. And as we just prepare to sing that together for a moment, I just want to invite you right where you're watching from, wherever you're at for a moment, just to close your eyes and just imagine with me what it was like to be a part of the story 2,000 years ago. Imagine being in the field with the shepherds and seeing the angel and then the multitude of angels and hearing the good news they proclaimed and then running to be with Jesus. I want you to imagine for a moment what it was like to be there with Mary and Joseph and the baby, to see the King who came humbly into the world to rescue and restore. And as you imagine what it must have been like to be there and kind of find yourself in the story, I want you to reflect on these words. I want to read from a couple of more obscure of verses from O Come All Ye Faithful that I think capture so well what we're talking about today. These words that go like this: see how the shepherds, summoned to his cradle, leaving their flocks, draw near to gaze. We too will toward him bend our joyful footsteps. Oh, come, let us adore him, Christ the Lord. And then one last verse that we have in that song, it says this about Jesus himself: child who for us sinners laid poor and in the manger, we would embrace thee with our love and awe. Who would not love thee, having loved us so dearly? Oh, come, let us adore him, Christ the Lord. As we picture ourselves there and reflect on these words, let's sing these kind of the versions of this chorus together as a way of committing ourselves to come and adore him. As we reflect on Christmas and our King who is so worthy of our praise.
Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him. Oh, come, let us adore him, Christ the Lord. For he alone is worthy, for he alone is worthy, for he alone is worthy, Christ the Lord. We give you the praise.
Well, again, those are such amazing words that we've just sung together, and I hope those will be words that really define us as people and as a church as we walk through this Christmas season together. So let me just kind of pray those over us and pray over us what we've talked about together today. Lord Jesus, we come before you. Just as we sang, we come to worship and adore you. We'll give you all the glory, for you alone are worthy. Jesus, we thank you for what you came to do 2,000 years ago, but also for what you're continuing to do in our world today. And Lord, as your people or as people who are wrestling with and trying to figure out maybe for the first time what we think about you, we just pray that in this season you would reveal yourself to us as you did to the shepherds, and that you would help each of us to respond to you in the way that they did as well, that we would refuse to ignore you, either out of our pride or our self-centeredness, that we refuse to ignore you out of our distractions and busyness, and instead that we would choose to adore you out of awe and gratefulness for who you are and for all you do. Jesus, this world, this life, it all revolves around you. It's all for you and because of you. And so we join in with the rest of all of creation and just bowing our knee, humbling our lives before you, and worshiping you as our King. We praise you. We thank you. We pray this in your strong and awesome name, the name of Jesus. And everybody said, amen. Listen, if you were tuning in with us today and maybe you've been at this for a while, following Jesus or a part of our church family, we want to encourage you again, let's run to Jesus. Let's seek him out in this season. If you're watching today and maybe this is all brand new to you, you've wrestled with who Jesus is, maybe thought about how you want to respond to him, we want to help you with that. We'd love to engage you right there online with our team that's chatting, or have you fill out one of the connection cards and just tell us that you want some help in processing who Jesus is and how you can put your trust in him and how you can follow after him. We're here for you with that. And so we're going to continue to pray that God will help us to adore Jesus throughout this season. Next week, we hope you'll come back and join us as we continue the series. And we're going to be next week back on site and online again. So we invite you to join us in one of those two ways. And let's just keep leaning into him and worshiping and adoring him as we walk to Christmas together. Have a great week. We'll see you later.
Thank you again for worshiping with us today. If you'd like someone to pray with you, there are members of our church online team or our staff who would love to do that. Simply click on the live prayer button at pccfw.tv or click the conversation bubble on the PCC at Home app. We encourage you to continue your worship through giving. Just click the Give button on the web or the app, or text the word GIVE. Finally, be sure to check the web or the app for the latest updates and at-home resources. We also share many updates through Facebook, Instagram, and our weekly e-news, so be sure to follow or subscribe. Have a great week, and we'll see you soon.